Maria grew up amid poverty, but she never felt poor. In the village of San Giovanni Rotondo, where the stone houses seemed to hold time within their walls, she learned from an early age that what was essential was not found in pockets, but in the heart. Her mother, Teresa, was a seamstress and worked until late into the night by the faint light of a candle, trying to ensure that Maria and her brother Giuseppe had at least a piece of bread on the table. Her father, who had been a mason, had left early, leaving a void that was never filled. Since then, the family's life became a silent struggle, where every day was one with effort and prayer. The little girl watched her mother with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Teresa never complained, but Maria noticed when tears silently ran down her face, while the fingers injured by the needle insisted on working. The nights were long, and many times Maria woke to the sound of her mother's muffled crying, who thought she was alone in her pain. It was in those moments that the little girl, with her small, cold hands, closed her eyes and prayed to God for something she had never dared to say aloud, that her mother might rest without fear of tomorrow. The other children in the village asked for toys, new clothes, or sweets whenever there was a celebration at the church. Maria, however, could not think of herself. What she wanted would not fit in a gift bag, nor could it be bought with coins. Her greatest desire was to see her mother smile without carrying the weight of worry in her eyes. But how does one ask for something so great? How could God possibly listen to such a small girl? It was then that she heard about Padre Pio. The elders spoke of him with an almost sacred respect, mentioning his hands marked by the stigmata and the miracles that occurred around him. They said that he could see into souls and knew things that no one else did. Some of the village women swore that he was always accompanied by the scent of roses, even when there were no flowers nearby. To Maria, he seemed like someone who could understand what her heart desired. The following Sunday, she decided to go to the convent of Our Lady of Graces, where Padre Pio celebrated Mass. She did not know exactly what she would do once she got there, but she was certain that she had to try. With a heavy heart and innocent faith, Maria left home at dawn without telling her mother. She walked along the stone streets, with her worn-out shoes hurting her feet, not imagining that that day would change her life forever. The church at the convent of Our Lady of Graces was packed. People from everywhere came to see Padre Pio, seeking consolation, forgiveness, or even a miracle. The smell of incense mixed with the contained breaths of the crowd, who anxiously awaited the start of the Mass. Maria, too small to see over the shoulders of the adults, tried to slip between the people, feeling her heart beat fast in her chest. She had never been so close to someone so holy, and a part of her feared that when he looked at her, Padre Pio might see everything she carried in her heart. She managed to get close to the altar, where the friars were helping to organize the faithful. The convent doors opened, and a deep silence fell over the space. Padre Pio entered, walking slowly, with his eyes lowered and his hands covered by his woolen gloves. Maria felt a shiver run down her skin. There was something different about that man. It wasn't just his tired appearance or the humble way he walked, but an invisible presence that seemed to fill the entire church. For a moment, Maria wanted to run, but her feet were glued to the ground. Mass began, and the little girl, even though she did not understand all the words in Latin, listened intently. Her plan was to wait until the end of the celebration to approach him, but when Padre Pio raised his hands for the blessing, something unexpected happened. A shove from the crowd caused Maria to lose her balance. She tried to steady herself, but she stumbled and fell right at the priest's feet. The impact was slight, yet the entire church seemed to hold its breath. Padre Pio immediately bent down, ignoring the murmurs around him. He firmly held the girl's shoulders, helping her to stand. When his eyes met hers, Maria felt an inexplicable warmth run through her body. The priest's gaze was intense, as if he could see far beyond her fragile appearance. He did not ask her name or where she came from. He simply looked at her for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, Without Maria uttering a single word, he whispered something that made her tremble. "God has already heard your request, my daughter." Maria was speechless. How did he know? How could he know something she had never told anyone? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she felt a lump in her throat. She had no answers, but in that moment she realized that something was about to change. Padre Pio placed his hand on the girl's head and made the sign of the cross, blessing her. Then, without further explanation, he headed toward the sacristy, leaving Maria there, with her heart racing and a premonition that her life would never be the same. Mass continued, but Maria could barely concentrate on the words. Her heart pounded, as if something was about to happen. When communion began, the girl took advantage of the movement of the faithful to approach the altar. Her bare feet touched the cold floor of the church, and her hands trembled as she clutched the small rosary tucked into her dress pocket. She needed to find a way to speak with Padre Pio, but how? He was surrounded by people, each with their own pain and pleas, and she was just a little girl. Then, in the middle of the crowd, a hurried woman accidentally bumped into her. Maria stumbled and fell hard to the ground, right in front of Padre Pio. The impact was enough for everyone around to stop and watch the scene. A silence fell over the space. The girl felt her face burn with shame, but before she could get up, she saw something that made her forget all her embarrassment. Padre Pio had bent down and was now looking directly at her. His eyes, deep and intense, seemed to pierce her soul. He extended his hand, marked by the stigmata, and helped Maria to stand up. "What are you doing here, little one?" he asked in his deep yet comforting voice. The girl, still with tearful eyes, clutched the rosary tightly in her hands, and without thinking, blurted out the words that had been locked in her heart. "Father, I don't want money. I just want my mother to have a chance." The words came out haltingly, laden with emotion and sincerity. Padre Pio remained silent for a few moments, still holding the little girl's hands in his own. The faithful around, who had been expecting to hear common petitions for healing or blessing, now watched the scene moved. "And what do you wish for your mother?" asked the friar, tilting his head slightly. Maria took a deep breath and answered in a firm voice, as if all her insecurity had suddenly vanished. "She works day and night sewing, but she never earns enough. I just want her to have the opportunity to live without so much suffering." Padre Pio's gaze softened. He let out a light sigh, and without saying another word, placed his hand on the girl's head and closed his eyes. Maria felt an intense warmth spread through her body, as if something invisible and powerful were taking over the room. In that moment, she knew that something would change. She did not know how or when, but inside her, a certainty took shape. Her prayer had been heard. That night, when Maria returned home, she felt different, though she could not explain exactly what had happened. Her mother noticed the unusual brightness in her eyes and the serenity on her face, but the girl said nothing. How could she explain that feeling? All she knew was that something would change, and her faith allowed no doubts. She simply trusted. The next morning, a friar from the convent knocked on the door of the small stone house. Mrs. Teresa was startled to see a man in a cassock there, but before she could say anything, he smiled and handed her a small note. "Padre Pio asks that you come to the convent. He wants to speak with you." Teresa felt her heart race. Padre Pio, the holy man that so many sought. Why would he want to see her? What had her daughter done? With her mind full of questions, she hurried to fix her hair, and with Maria by her side, walked to the convent. When they arrived, Padre Pio was waiting for them at the entrance. His eyes rested on Teresa, and without her saying a single word, he already seemed to know everything about her life. "My daughter, God has heard your pains through the prayer of a pure little soul," he said. Teresa looked at Maria, confused. "You work as a seamstress, don't you?" The friar continued. "Yes, Father, but times are difficult." "There isn't always anyone who can pay for my work," Teresa replied. Padre Pio smiled gently. From today on, you will not have to worry about that. The convent needed new cassocks, altar towels, and clothes for the needy. Padre Pio announced that Teresa would be responsible for that task and would receive a fair amount for her work. Moreover, the nuns at the convent wanted to open a sewing workshop to help other women in the village, and Teresa would be in charge of teaching them. Suddenly, what had seemed impossible became a reality. Teresa would not only have a dignified job, but she would also help other families support themselves. Tears streamed silently down the seamstress's face. Maria, beside her mother, smiled as if she already knew that everything would end this way. Teresa fell to her knees before Padre Pio, overcome with emotion. "Thank you, Father. Thank you," she whispered. He simply placed his hand on her head and murmured, "Thank God, and thank your daughter's faith." The following days were like a breath of hope for Teresa. For the first time in years, she could sew without the weight of uncertainty crushing her chest. In the small, improvised atelier at the convent, her hands moved with renewed agility, as if each stitch were a silent prayer of gratitude. Other women began to arrive, some widows, others single mothers, all carrying that same tired look that she once had. Gradually, the sewing workshop became a refuge, a place where work was not merely a means of survival, but an act of faith and rebuilding. Maria watched everything with a heart overflowing with joy. Her mother, who once wept in secret, now smiled as she worked. Giuseppe, her younger brother, no longer went to sleep hungry. The entire village seemed to have been touched by something greater. The friars at the convent, recognizing the importance of the initiative, helped to expand the project. What had once been just a humble seamstress trying to survive became a network of women rescuing one another from misery. Padre Pio occasionally passed by the workshop, observing in silence, his gaze filled with something that no one could explain, as if he had known from the very beginning that this would happen. Teresa's name began to spread. People from other towns started seeking her sewing work, enchanted by the quality of her work and the story behind it. It was not long before a generous merchant decided to invest in the workshop, providing materials and expanding opportunities for more women. What had begun as a small favor from the convent transformed into something much greater. Many called it luck, others coincidence. But Maria knew the truth. Since the day she fell at Padre Pio's feet, an invisible thread of divine grace had been weaving their lives. One day, while Maria was walking through the convent, she saw Padre Pio sitting on a bench in the courtyard, gazing at the sky, his calloused hands resting on his rosary. She approached timidly, and he, without taking his eyes off the horizon, whispered softly, "The faith of a child moves mountains." Maria felt a shiver. She wanted to thank him, but she did not know how, so she simply smiled. He closed his eyes, as if understanding without the need for words. The village was never the same after that encounter. Teresa prospered without ever losing her humility, helping other women to find dignity in their work. Maria grew up with the certainty that miracles were not always made of lights and voices from heaven. Sometimes a miracle was an open door, an unexpected opportunity, or even a man in a cassock who recognized a need before it was spoken. The years passed, but what happened in that small village was never forgotten. The sewing workshop grew, becoming a beacon of hope for countless women who once had no choice but misery. What began with a simple need for sustenance turned into a true movement of charity and dignity. Teresa, once a seamstress who worked by candlelight, now taught young apprentices and needy widows, ensuring that no woman would have to endure the hardships she had once faced. Maria grew up amidst it all, shaped not only by the miracle she had witnessed, but by the unshakable faith she learned from Padre Pio. She never forgot the day she fell at his feet, and how, with a single look, he seemed to know everything she carried in her heart. Now, as a teenager, she dedicated herself to her studies and dreamed of working in a hospital, helping the poor and the sick, just as the friar did with his prayers and confessions. Padre Pio always said that prayer was the remedy for the soul, but Maria longed to be the hands that healed bodies as well. Time brought changes. Padre Pio grew older and his health weakened, but his presence continued to be a beacon for everyone. On a cold afternoon, Maria went to the convent and found him sitting on the same bench where years before he had told her that the faith of a child moves mountains. His eyes were closed, and a slight smile rested on his face. "Father, I never knew how to thank you," she whispered. He slowly opened his eyes and without hesitation replied, "Keep going. That will be enough." And so she did. Maria continued on her path, became a nurse, and later found her purpose helping the sick in the same hospital founded by Padre Pio. Yet something remained inexplicable over the years. Some nights, while sewing a fabric for the patients or praying beside one, she would sense a gentle fragrance of roses filling the room, a scent that no one could explain where it came from. The nuns at the hospital, when asked, only smiled and said, "The saints never completely leave us." Padre Pio's name echoed around the world, and many witnessed miracles through his intercession. But for Maria, the true miracle was not an extraordinary or supernatural event. The true miracle was a man who saw beyond words, who extended his hand to a little girl, and with a single gesture changed her destiny and that of many others. His legacy was not only in the stories told by his devotees, but in every woman who now sewed without fear of tomorrow, in every patient who received loving care, in every child who learned to trust that God would always provide. No one ever managed to fully explain what happened to Maria and her family. But those who witnessed it know that, in some mysterious way, Padre Pio continues to act invisibly, guiding those who place their faith in the unseen. Because some miracles are not made to be understood, they are made only to be lived. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of faith. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of miracles and overcoming adversity. Join our community to strengthen your faith and be inspired by real-life testimonies.